Alright, so we're going to talk about the characteristics of life, why they are important, and why we need them. Start off, every living thing is made out of cells. Cells are the smallest living thing possible. It is possible to have things that are smaller, but you wouldn't classify them as alive. Things like atoms or molecules. They are definitely smaller than cells, but they are not alive. 2. Reproduction. Simply put, reproduction means making more organisms. A couple different ways you can do this. Sexual reproduction, not to get too detailed here, but all you need for sexual reproduction is somebody else. Let's not go into it anymore. There's also, and this is a sexually reproducing species that is not interested in somebody else. Asexual reproduction, simply put, you don't need someone else. Let's not go into too many details there, but you can see this is an example of a cell just splitting in half. That is asexual reproduction. Genetic code is a fancy way of saying DNA, and DNA is a very fancy way of talking about the information or a recipe for how you make an organism. That is a baby organism or a fetal organism that is going to grow up and be an elephant. And how is it going to know if it needs to turn into an elephant? Well, that information is in its DNA. All of life uses the exact same language of DNA, composed of only 4 letters, A, C, T, and G. More on that later. Next up, growing and developing. To grow means to just get bigger, to increase in size. This is what you see as a full-size baby. Fortunately, babies don't get full size, but if they did, they'd be freaky looking. They have giant heads. Instead, as we get older, we develop, which is a fancy way of saying we differentiate or we change shape or structure. And we don't just get bigger, we also change. Bacteria are an example of a species that just gets bigger. Humans also change. Here you can see how our body sizes change over time. Metabolism. Metabolism, simply put, is using materials and energy. Eating and pooping. This is an organism that is eating. It is going to eventually poop. That's not going to be shown. Plants will also do this as well, using the sun's energy to make food in the process known as photosynthesis. Response. Organisms detect and respond to stimuli or changes in their environment. This is an example of a rabbit looking at changes in its environment, and it is responding to it. Even plants will do this, obviously not as fast. Plants will grow toward the light if you leave them sitting out long enough. Plants will also respond other ways, more on that later. Homeostasis is a fancy way of saying the internal environment stays the same. That's temperature, pH, oxygen, carbon dioxide. All of those things are going to remain relatively the same. It's like a thermostat. You don't set a thermostat to heat or cool. You set a thermostat to a temperature, and it decides if it needs to heat or cool. Even when the outside environment changes, internally things stay pretty much the same. And finally, evolution. As a group, living things will change over time. Populations of organisms will evolve, individuals will not. So let's review. Which characteristic is this? This is an example of a cat that tries to sit on a hedgehog and it doesn't go well. Try sitting on a hedgehog. You will probably have the same reaction because you respond to your environment. It detected a change in its environment, and that change was a very large point to its butt, and it responded by moving away. This one right here is an example of Patrick the starfish eating. Well, that eating right there is an example of metabolism. He takes in food, he produces waste. Thankfully, we don't see that side of the animation.